pandemic as quickly as possible. Is it that what is being suggested now is different from that, or are we seeking to build on that work and those recommendations?
That's a valuable comment. And I think I'll, of course, defer to our Jamaican colleagues and really thinking about next steps for the civil society working group and the government and that collaboration moving forward. But just a quick note to say that that's exactly the kind of initiatives that we're hoping to see scaled up through the open government action plans. And I think, you know, obviously it's always better to build on what works in your own backyard and what's, you know, the proven track record that does exist and where there are some really strong foundations to build from. The benefit of incorporating that kind of thing into an action plan is that you do have that structure behind it. And you do have an additional resource in terms of the Open Government Support Unit, as well as our independent review mechanism, who can provide some feedback and be able to track a bit of that progress from an external perspective. But I'll defer the rest of the question to my colleagues on the call.
Sure, Helene, oh, go ahead, Richard.
No, I would just comment. Thanks, Helene. And I know you were in fact involved in the task force. We're going to have a Professor Wint, who is also part of that initiative. Will be speaking to that a little later in the program. The recommendations of that task force were quite far-reaching, very wide-ranging, and they certainly wouldn't be replaced in any way by the Open Government Partnership process, which would seek to be informed by processes such as the outcomes of the task force. But the ambit of the task force's recommendations would go, you know, considerably beyond the scope of the OGP process. There would be some intersection where the objectives are similar, but it wouldn't in any way replace what the task force did.
Okay.
Thank you, and I think that's a good segue into the next segment as well, where we're kind of want to say thank you to Alison for her thoughts and kind of bringing some of that global context. And where we're going to go next is to talk about the ways that the government of Jamaica has been leading and has been, you know, operating in a way that encourages collaboration and transparency. So we're going to be kicking off a series of lightning talks, so to speak. And in this part of the session, we're going to start with the Minister of Finance, who will be represented by Mr. Richard Lumsden. Then we're going to go to the Minister of Health, who is represented by Dunstan Bryan, the Permanent Secretary within the Ministry of MOH. And then lastly, we're going to have Professor Alvin Wint, who is a member of the COVID-19 Task Force, who will talk a little bit about how, you know, that task force kind of has been a manifestation of the collaboration between the public and the government to move us forward in the COVID response. So without further ado, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Matthew. And just to advise our listeners that Mr. Dunstan Bryan from the Ministry of Health and Wellness will also be joined by Dr. Jacqueline Biseso McKenzie, who is the Chief Medical Officer. Now, the government of Jamaica recognized the projected public health and economic impact of the pandemic from its outset. And the fiscal response, which is largely what I'll be speaking to, was initially reflected in a contingency provision in the budget for 2021, which was approved in March of 2020. At the time of the first revision of the budget in May 2020, it was projected that the pandemic would have caused an economic contraction of GDP of between 4% and 6% in fiscal year 2020-21. Since then, the economic projections have worsened to a projected contraction of between 10 to 12% of GDP for the current fiscal year. That the estimates were that the revenues to the government would decline by approximately $81 billion versus the estimates that were approved in March last year, while other inflows would be lower by $5 billion. So that's a significant impact, both in terms of the economic growth impact and the fiscal impact. Now, in response, the government relaxed the primary fiscal surplus target from the 5.4% of GDP that had been approved for fiscal year 2021 to 3.5% of GDP, so as to accommodate the adjustments that needed to be made, including emergency expenditures. And this target was further relaxed to 3% of GDP. This is the primary surplus. In this case, was reduced to 3% of GDP most recently. The fiscal rules under the fiscal responsibility framework were suspended for the current fiscal year, and the target date for attainment of the debt to GDP objective of 60% was pushed back by 2 years to fiscal year 2027-28 to accommodate the shock. The government also approved the largest stimulus package in the country's history, including a $31 billion stimulus consisting of approximately $15 billion in tax cuts and a spending stimulus of $16 billion. Also, additional health expenditures of $6 billion and public body support of $3 billion made for a total fiscal intervention of approximately $40 billion in the first supplementary estimates that were tabled in May of 2020 to support critical areas, including agriculture and fisheries, assistance to the homeless, those in shelters and the elderly in infirmaries, the disabled, path beneficiaries, and other vulnerable Jamaicans. Subsequent fiscal interventions, although not at that same scale, were made in the second and third supplementary estimates. Significant support, as was mentioned, was provided to the Ministry of Health and Wellness, including funding for additional staffing, equipment, supplies, testing and tracing, and other expenditures. And we'll hear, as was announced, we'll hear more from the Permanent Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer on the government's public health response to the pandemic. In addition, other measures were taken, for example, at the Student Loan Bureau, involving payment deferrals and processing fee waivers, the National Housing Trust, involving interest rate reductions, and other measures such as waivers of duties on personal hygiene products, waiver of SCT on alcohol used to make sanitizers, etc. The response also included, as has also been mentioned, the establishment of a cabinet-approved multi-sectoral task force chaired by the Minister of Finance to help chart Jamaica's economic recovery from the fallout caused by the pandemic. And we will hear more from Professor Wint, a member of that task force, on its establishment, operations, and outcomes. Also included, and this is the last area that I will really speak to in the time that we have, was the government's response was the establishment of the COVID-19 Allocation of Resources for Employees, or CARE program, launched in April 2020 with funding of $14 billion in the first instance. The CARE program represents a temporary transfer of cash to individuals and businesses to cushion the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As is already known and has been, in operation for some time since its launch, the main components of the CARE program include the set cash, or supporting employees with transfer of cash component for laid off employees in all sectors, the best cash, business employee support and transfer of cash for tourist board registered employers, general grants to municipality, transport and small tourism occupations, compassionate grants for marginally employed or unemployed persons, path grants for path beneficiaries, small business grants for small businesses earning less than $50 million a year, tourism grants for tourist board registered entities, and student loan relief, as previously mentioned. Now, accessibility, which has been highlighted as an important component in open response, accessibility to the CARE program was enhanced by allowing online applications as much as possible, and by supporting the program through public education and a call center for customer support with a dedicated helpline at 888-4-WE-CARE. As a measure for transparency and accountability in the execution of the CARE program, concurrent audits were also performed by the Auditor General's Department, with 3 audit reports on the components of the CARE program performed and published by the Auditor General between April and December of 2020. Another aspect that facilitates transparency is that the budgetary allocations for COVID-19 related expenditure by central government ministries, departments, and agencies are recorded in the estimates of expenditure under a unique activity for COVID-19 response. And this includes activities funded not only from public resources, but activities funded as grants and donations. This allows for ease of tracking and reporting on the allocation. So with that said, as an overview of the response, primarily focusing on the fiscal response, we look forward to the remaining presentations in this section and to the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. We're going to go straight to Dunstan Bryan and the Ministry of Health to give their talk. And Jacqueline.
Okay, I'm not good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if the permanent secretary is actually on.
Okay, no worries, go ahead.
I think he has offloaded this to me.
So not quite CMO. But I will, given that you have the lion's share of this presentation, I will yield to you. But just to say, as a pressy your presentation, that the Ministry of Health and Wellness is very, very au fait and very happy to be a part of the open government concept. And throughout our COVID experience, one of the philosophies that we have anchored our intervention on is the fact that we have to open the conversation to all, because the necessity for all to be on board was essential to us achieving the effective and efficient rollout of the vaccine, of the COVID response plan. And so I am indeed very happy to be a part of this discussion, and I'm happy that we were invited to share our experience. And with that, I'll turn over to the CMO, who will make our intervention to this conversation. CMO.
Thank you, Piers. And again, thank you for everyone for giving us the opportunity to share. My interpretation of the topic may be a little bit different, because we would not have been able to cover everything that we would have done in terms of responses in this short time, but really just focusing on the openness of our response and recovery. So I'm going to share screen.
Go ahead.
Right, okay. So I really focused on the 4 phases of our response in terms of the phasing that is utilized by the WHO, and just to look at each phase and how it is that we ensured that there was open communication and an openness to what we were doing and understanding in this public space, and in terms of both our internal and external stakeholders. A very important part of our openness does not only have to deal with in terms of what's happening in the government, in terms of sharing of information, and not only to do with what we share with the population, but a very, very important part is our openness as a ministry to our internal stakeholders for there to be complete buy-in and support that goes both ways. Us supporting the service delivery sites, the service delivery sites supporting what it is that we're doing. So that has been a very important part as we go through each phase of our response in terms of maintaining that. In terms of, let me just, are you seeing my slide?
Yep, we are.
Okay. And do you see do you have the slide moving?
Yeah, no cases. That's where we are.
Okay. All right. So certainly, we started our response from in January, as a matter of fact. In mid-January, when we really started to get a sense of what was happening in China, and the WHO started to share information to sensitize the world that something was happening that we needed to pay attention to. Jamaica, from a public health perspective, have always responded to that kind of call. Sometimes even when persons may think, oh, that don't have anything to do with you, it's not where we reach here. So we have always been very alert from a public health standpoint as to what is being circulated to us from the WHO. And we actually started our placement of ads in the newspaper, sensitizing the public to COVID-19 in mid-January. So in terms of communication, of course, our role in terms of conveying the country's risk to the population, again, for it not to be a situation that was happening in China, not going to happen here, not going to come here. It was important to convey that the risk that the country was facing, considering that we do have a section of the population that does quite a bit of business with China. And so there's a lot of business travel. We're out of many one people, and we also have a lot of Jamaican nationals that are Chinese, have Chinese origins in terms of their families. And so there's also a lot of personal travel. There's also study. A lot of our population study in China. And so there is a lot of relations with China. And it was important that the country understood that there something happening in China was posed a risk to us. So that was one of the first things that we needed to be open to the population about. And we started that very early, and that early starting was key to the sensitization of the public. Getting the health sector ready was in terms of our open communications with our internal stakeholders, the ensuring that persons understood what isolation meant, what kind of isolation, understood about the virus, what was the threat that it posed to us, the health sector. Having been very integral in the preparation of for Ebola, another very contagious disease, I would have been sensitized as to the kind of fear that it elicited in 2014. And that fear would have started within or was propelled a lot by the fear in the health sector. And so it was very important for us to start being very open with our internal stakeholders as to what it was that it required, what it is that they required in terms of being ready, in terms of their personal protective equipment, in terms of having those things ready, in terms of having the spaces, the isolation spaces ready for in case we had a case. Educating the population, again, we would have addressed that. Addressing the fear in the population, the stigma. I mean, if from the 31st of January, when we announced the travel ban and we had to place persons in quarantine, and then moving on from then, just having persons in quarantine in their homes, we started out initially, of course, placing everybody in facility quarantine, but then we did have some persons that were in their homes, and that created quite a bit of, whether it was rumor or whether it was true, you would hear the stories of, I know that somebody came back from China and that they are there and the community is in fear. So there was a whole issue of being open with the population, explaining our processes. We had to address the concerns. Very big on the table at that time was the issue of ventilators. Did we have enough ventilators? We had several, for press conferences, we had to speak about those things, saying what it is that we had, what it is that we would want to have, and how it is that we were going to reach there. In terms of the preparation of the isolation and the quarantine spaces, again, initially when we started out using one space, the Allardyce facility, we had not publicized that we were using it as a quarantine facility. But then when we moved to Vineyard Town, when we wanted to take over the St. Joseph's facility and converting it into a quarantine facility, that required quite a bit of explanation. And I show you here the picture going back to those days on February the 10th, when we ventured into Vineyard Town and faced the wrath of the community as to why it is that we were going to bring this facility here. Again, part of the effort in just trying to educate persons and being very open with the population and not trying to hide under the bush to do anything, but to address the questions that would have arisen out of these interventions. Again, with regards to that, we formed the COVID-19 Advisory Committee. This was the Ministers' Advisory Committee, which engaged the private sector. So right from early in March, we had several persons that were sitting at the table that was providing information, their opinions. And as a health sector, we had to deal with a lot of things that necessarily we did not agree with, but we understood where persons were coming on. They were given an opportunity to put their information on the table, and we were able to respond to them. Sometimes it could have been quite heated at times. People want to see certain things done. We saying that this is the public health way of doing it. We have to stick to the path. But it was the effort, certainly in terms of getting the engagement of persons and having the conversations with them, was critical, rather than not hearing and just hiding away and doing our thing. So these committees that engage the private sector were important. In terms of the overall public health response and it being in a public response, and not from the start going out into private sector, was very important in terms of this whole response to a public health emergency. What was required from us from an international level, that if there were cases or near cases that we had to deal with, it was done in an equitable manner, that there was equal access to one service, was critical right from the start, and has been critical over the last year for us in just trying to ensure that the service that we offer is up to standard. It is one service that is provided to everyone, and that there is no unfairness in some persons getting this, some persons getting that, some persons having a better room, some persons not in a different kind of situation. It was just ensuring that from a public sector response, that there was equity. When we had quarantine facilities and we put people in the hotel, it was not just the rich people that was going to the hotel and the poor people somewhere else. It was this importance of a public sector response and public sector financing of this response was critical. And where we brought in our private stakeholders was to support that response and not necessarily finding an alternative pathway. let me move to the next slide. So those were things that we accomplished and started to work on in the first phase when we had no cases in terms of being open and responsive to the public and to our stakeholders. In terms of when we went on to the second phase and we had sporadic cases, when we discovered our first case, when we discovered our first case, of course, communication took on a new meaning because prompt notification was very important, and we were very up on that. Prompt notification to the public, the explanation, regular updates. This was particularly critical because in terms of the response, there was need for community engagement and there was need for community buy-in. And so the regular communication with everybody knowing what was happening was critical. The managing the evolution of the information and the evolution of the scientific evidence was also very important. And it was very important for us from a ministry and from the technocrats' point of view to be out there, myself personally as Chief Medical Officer, to be out there to build confidence, to allow the public to understand that we were being honest and we were being frank about what the situation was, that things change. But for them to understand that when things change, it was not because we were dishonest in the first place, but was that the information was evolving. So that building of confidence and that building of trust was important. And we started out with our communication program, just working on that and being out there. And that has held us very well over time, where a lot of things have changed over time and people could go back and say, but you did say that, how are you saying that now? And we really have not had that to deal with because of the confidence and trust that the people have placed in us because we have been honest and frank. Also in terms of our documentation and putting the information in black and white, this was also important, and very early we started to update our website. People could rely on the fact that every day we were going to get a press release to say what was happening. The formulation of our guidelines and our protocols that were put out there on our website was all out there for everyone to see so that they could follow. When we moved on to cluster of cases, and we started to have the cluster of cases in the workplace, in different communities, we started to have many more communities having clusters, then we needed to address particular settings. And we had to look now at how it is that we engage and communicate with, in particular, the work sector, the business sector, to ensure that we had buy-in and everybody was happy with how we were addressing things, how we were responding. So we went on to develop our workplace protocols. We managed the BPO situation by having a stakeholder group that involved both the private sector, persons from the BPOs, public health, and we worked together to come to an agreement. A lot of committees formed that involved different stakeholder groups that really increased our openness and the ability of everyone to see what was happening. So this engagement was key as the pandemic evolved and we saw that there was a need, we addressed it through these kinds of settings. The engagement of key participants in community interventions, again through the broad stakeholder, starting from when we sat at the government level in terms of offering advice to the cabinet and to the government, where we had all the ministries present. When we had community intervention, there was buy-in from local government, there was buy-in from security, there was buy-in from social security, to ensure that the response that we had at that level was coordinated, and then also for the information to filter to the local level with the local boards of health, the parish councillors, the police on the ground, so that everyone knew, understand what was happening, and that there was buy-in and one cause that everyone was supporting. We also ensured that whenever we went into areas, there was visibility of the health team. There was a post for the health team so that we could see the community members could constantly be conversing with us if they had issues, if there was somebody who was not getting a meal package, if there was somebody who got sick that needed to be taken out. Our constant visibility was important in terms of maintaining that communication. And of course, in terms of our response to those concerns.
CMO?
Yes.
I just thank you. I wanted to allow you to finish. Just wanted to, because we have 3 more speakers, so I want to make sure that we can get through them in the time. So if you can give us kind of the other key points, because we're definitely not going to be able to cover all the good things the ministry has been doing. So just wanted to just flag that to you. Thank you.
Okay, so community transmission, these were the areas that we looked at, the increased communication with the internal stakeholders, because we recognized that the hospitals were key. And pretty much we kept, that responsiveness in terms of openness to the public, the continuous communication with the public. And of course, now that we move into vaccine deployment, we would be looking at the same methods of communication and sensitization of the public and rolling out our communication plans to address fear, increase knowledge, update the public on the schedules for vaccination, and of course, ensuring no one is left behind. And my last slide in terms of our recovery plan, we have not pushed out to the public as a single unit or recovery plan. And so there may have been be a gap in the communication in terms of saying that this is our recovery plan. But the measures taken during the pandemic and the capacity that we have built as we respond is part of our recovery process. And therefore, we would have seen our changes in infrastructure, in human resources, in the use of technology, the expansion of our laboratory capacity, improvements in the border security and health, and improvements in surveillance. These are all areas that we are addressing that would help us in recovering better and is helping us in responding to the pandemic. And that's my last slide.
Thank you very much, CMO. Not just for this session, but also just for the work that you and the team at the Ministry of Health have been doing over the last year. I've watched many of your briefings, and so they've all been very helpful. And I think there are a number of questions that I have and others may have, but I'm going to give it to Professor Wint, who kind of sits on another aspect of this as part of that, joint private civil society government kind of group reflecting on how we open back up the economy, to share his thoughts as well.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share with you the work of the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force. And I wanted to focus both on the antecedents, the structure, and some of the outcomes. So as Mrs. Helene Davis-White, President of the Confederation, pointed out, this task force was established. This was also mentioned by and it was established by Prime Minister Honus on the 27th of April, again, as pointed out by Mr. Lumsden, under the chairmanship of Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. But what's interesting, particularly for our forum today, is to understand how the task force began. So when Prime Minister Honus announced the establishment of the task force, he indicated that Jamaica's social partners had come to him expressing their interest in participating in an all of Jamaica effort to respond to this unprecedented crisis that was confronting Jamaica and the world. But of course, social partners could only come to the Prime Minister if there was a social partnership process in Jamaica. And so it's worthwhile, and Alison, I think you'll appreciate this, trying to understand how Jamaica got to a point where the Prime Minister can say the social partners had approached him. So Jamaica's social partnership process is a process that has been built on social dialogue that has been going on for a rather long time in Jamaica. And it gives you an indication of the work that is required in creating an open and transparent framework in a country. So, in terms of multiple stakeholder organizations, really the first important one in Jamaica was on a single subject, which is electoral oversight, which took place with the creation of the Electoral Advisory Committee in 1979. But in terms of a broad-based attempt at social dialogue, the first effort really started in 1989, when the then Deputy Prime Minister, P.J. Patterson, who would go on to become one of Jamaica's prime ministers, initiated a National Planning Council. And when you go back and you read the ministerial and the cabinet report on that council, it's really quite refreshing, because it speaks to the importance of consultation, the importance of dialogue, the importance of bringing the partners together. So that National Planning Council was established in 1989. It went on until 2007, and it involved regular monthly meetings of the key economic ministers, economic agents of government, under the leadership of the Minister of Finance, with members from the trade union community, the civil society community, and the private sector. We also, in 1989, established labor advisory councils for a tripartite mechanism to recognize the importance of social dialogue on the labor front. And then this social dialogue process in Jamaica has been led at different levels. And so in 1997, a group under the leadership of Ward Mills called ACORN started a process of dialogue across the public sector, the private sector, the trade union movement, and civil society. And that group, which has really been important to Jamaica's social partnership effort, started in 1997 and has continued for 24 years consecutively, and is currently in operation. The Private Sector Organization of Jamaica led a Partnership of Progress Committee between 2003 and 2007, trying to ramp up social dialogue. PIOJ, everybody in Jamaica knows about Vision 2030. That secretariat was established in 2005, and that has involved a tremendous level of consultation across the length and breadth of Jamaica to try to get some consensus about Jamaica's long-term development goals. All of this came together in 2008 when Prime Minister Golding established a Social Partnership Consultative Committee, and that became the precursor to the establishment of a National Partnership Council, which was established in 2009 and has continued across consecutive administrations led by the Prime Minister and incorporating civil society, the trade union movement, private sector leadership, obviously with government ministers. And that has been the foundation, the bedrock for Jamaica's social partnership efforts. And that National Partnership Council has spawned 3 agreements. The first agreement was a code of conduct, so it was a behavioral agreement, but there have actually been 2 substantive agreements. Jamaica's first National Social Partnership Agreement, which was initiated under Simpson-Miller administration in 2013, called the Partnership for Jamaica, and then in 2016, the Partnership for a Prosperous Jamaica under the leadership of Prime Minister Honis. So that's the background, and that helps to understand why the social partners were in a position to approach the Prime Minister and to talk about this all of Jamaica approach. So the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force was established with an unprecedented structure for Jamaica. It built on the existing social partnership process, but it reflected the principle, and it's a principle that really is a derivative of a quote from former leader of the opposition, Dr. Peter Phillips, who would often say the work of nation building is the work of a nation. And the principle of the Economic Recovery Task Force was therefore the work of rebuilding a nation has to be the job of the nation. But also what was important was the effort to have a seamless transition from policy recommendations to policy implementation. And the way that this was achieved in the structure of the task force, which made it unprecedented, I don't believe there's ever been a task force established in Jamaica that involves 7 ministers of government with 21 leaders from civil society, the private sector, and the trade union movement. Unprecedented, but reflected the importance of this national response to this unprecedented crisis. And so it was really important in the task force process that it wasn't a civil society group and a private sector group making recommendations to the government, which they might or might not choose to implement. It was the civil society, private sector, trade union leaders sitting down with the ministers of government, trying to come up with the recommendations that would be implementable. So I think it was unique from that perspective. The process was also as open and consultative as possible, in the sense that it also involved the establishment of working committees. So the process involved 12 working committees. These were chaired either by government ministers or by public sector leaders or by private sector leaders. They involved an unprecedented level of transparency and inclusiveness in assessing Jamaica's COVID-19 related challenges. And so, for example, Mr. Lumsed pointed to the fact that early in the crisis, there was an adjustment in Jamaica's fiscal rules and its debt to GDP trajectory. These were matters that were discussed confidentially at the time by the Minister of Finance with the macro fiscal subcommittee of that task force to get a broader perspective on these kinds of changes. I don't know if this has happened before in Jamaica's history, but it was really important. And that level of transparency and openness applied across other committees as well. The total membership of these subcommittees and membership was drawn from the task force, but also from other public sector, private sector, trade union, and civil society leadership, exceeded 100 individuals. And the goal was to incorporate all the required expertise, but also to have as widespread a process of ownership of the development of this national recovery plan as was possible. Mrs. Helene Davis-White pointed to the fact that the task force report was finalized very quickly. It was established on the 27th of April. The report was submitted to the Prime Minister on the 30th of June. And the reason for the speed was it was important to try to ensure that the task force work would be relevant to the immediacy of the crisis. And this was not a situation where we could spend 3, 4, 6, 10 months coming up with a report when we were in the middle of the storm trying to figure out how to recover as effectively as possible. The key outcomes, and I know we have to go at lightning speed, so I'm going to go very quickly here. The key outcomes of the task force was a recognition that previous crises in Jamaica had taken up to a decade for Jamaica to recover from those previous economic crises. And these recovery processes have been slowed by insufficient attention to key challenges, particularly the importance of maintaining social and economic stability. And so the ERFT's goal was economic recovery within 2 to 4 years, but also trying to ensure that we would not repeat the mistakes of the past, and that also we would build Jamaica back stronger. The policy recommendations focused on included a COVID-19 resilient economy. The Minister of Health was a part of the task force, as was the Minister of Tourism. And so there was an important integration of issues there in terms of trying to ensure that we recover from the process in a resilient manner from a health perspective, while at the same time recommitting to macroeconomic stability, macro-social stability and reform, business climate improvements, restoring tourism in a COVID-19 resilient way, deepening local supply chains, which had been massively interrupted, boosting public sector efficiency, expanding national digitization, which obviously has been a key outcome of the COVID-19 crisis worldwide, economic diversification, economic formalization, improvement in social safety nets. And this goes again to the point that Alison was making, that the crisis has really dramatized levels of inequality. And so I think all countries have to recognize that there is so much work that is required on the social safety net improvement and on issues such as the gender considerations, labor market reform, and then strengthening the GOJ's technical resource capacity. There's much more that could be said. There's a long document on it. I just want to finish with the charge that the chairman of the task force gave to Jamaica in the final, in his final concluding section in the task force report. And I want to emphasize this because the Minister of Finance and the Public Service, in giving this charge, made it very clear that social consensus and social dialogue was the foundation on which the task force has been initiated and on which Jamaica's success would have to follow from. So here is Minister Clark. Though the road ahead may have difficult patches, there is reason for great optimism. In our short history, Jamaica has time and again demonstrated the ability to reform itself, to bounce back, to achieve the unachievable, and to confound the world. We need to look no further than our most recent history, where with social cohesion as the foundation, and social consensus as a support, Jamaica charted an unlikely course of reform that pre-COVID-19 resulted in a range of outcomes recognized and celebrated around the world. This time we are starting ahead. There is no precedent for a consensus-building, broad-based task force on economic recovery commissioned during the eye of any previous storm. That gives us a head start. We must use it, embrace reform with ambition, and rebuild Jamaica. And that really was the charge. And so, my sisters and brothers, I leave it at that.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Wint. I both appreciated the context, the background of the social partnership movement and evolution of those things, as well as kind of, well, how does that has manifested most recently in the present. We were scheduled to take a Q&A session. I see we're a little bit behind now. We'll take one question and then we'll get responses from the external partners, civil society, as well as Francesca from the IDB. So if there are any questions for any of the speakers, please let us know, either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. All right. I see there was a question from Daniel earlier, which I can raise. I can just kind of read this. In some countries, the response to the COVID pandemic has resulted in restrictions on some access to information rights, longer delays in receiving information, suspension of responding to requests for information. As we now approach the receiving vaccinations, how can we encourage greater transparency around the vaccination process, access to contracts for COVID-19 vaccines, understanding how decisions are made and how they will be distributed and who will be prioritized? The CMO just kind of gave some apologies. She did have to step away, but wanted to, I don't know if this has come up in the conversations, either your conversations, Richard, or Professor Wint. The idea of the vaccine component of the recovery has come up in the task force discussions as well. You're muted, Professor Wint.
In relation to the task force report was commissioned in June. In June, we had no sense of when the vaccine would have been available. And so they didn't really feature. But the process, I know, of openness and dialogue has continued. And the CMO, I'm sure, can speak to this. But the Ministry of Health has recently entered into a memorandum of understanding with several private sector leaders in relation to trying to have a joined up approach to the vaccine distribution process. And again, this kind of stakeholder involvement is really an outgrowth of what we have been describing at the partnership level. And also, as the CMO pointed out, certainly even before the task force, the Ministry of Health had begun a process of engagement with private sector leaders about how to have a multi-sectoral response to this, again, this unprecedented crisis confronting the country.
Richard, I see you unmuted. I don't know if you wanted to comment on this point as well.
No, I was going to make reference to the same MOU same MOU that Prof mentioned. Okay.
All right. Thank you both for that. Well, let's jump to the civil society and kind of the international partner part of the discussion, and then we'll come back for any Q&A at the end if there are any on that. So we're gonna start with Ms. Janet Calder from the director of JAMP, who is an active member of civil society in a number of different areas. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Jeanette, and then after that, we'll have Francesca De Simeone from the IDB as well. Over.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew. It is really wonderful to be here. It really has been a real well-spent hour or more, and I'm glad that I'll be able to speak on behalf of CSOs, but in particular, the one that I represent, the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal. JAMP is just about a year and a half old, and I think is well poised in terms of what its mandate is and where its heart lies in terms.
Sorry,
of
Jeanette, I'm not hearing you very well.
Well, is that
I don't know if anyone else is having. I'm not hearing you very well.
Is that
the
the
audio
case
is a bit low?
Is that the case for everybody, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm hearing
Yes,
you.
Jeanette. It's a little low. It's a little
It's a
low,
little
Jeanette.
low.
I don't know if there's anything you can do.
Let me see. I'm gonna see if I can revert to the laptop. How is this? Is this any better?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, not so bad.
Great.
Right, so I'm going to just share my screen while I introduce a little bit about what JAMP is, why I believe I was asked to share my thoughts, and where it is that we're going, why I believe if Jamaica does get a chance to do some COVID tracking, I would hope that we are well positioned to do so. And I say that because we have been really fortunate. Our implementing partner is the private sector organization of Jamaica. And we have been very fortunate because not only is JAMP a new project in terms of what it does, but it is a new organization. And to merge those two, starting an organization and a new project, you really need some strong partners with you. So we have our implementing partners, the private sector organization of Jamaica, and really fortunate and blessed to have the European Union giving us a 36-month commitment to get our feet under us as it relates to what our goal is. And that is basically to increase, as it says there on the screen, the quantity, quality, and the distribution of public goods and services. How? We want to reduce waste, loss, fraud, and corruption in the stewardship of the things the people own and all the things that God has blessed us with. Really, we just want to raise the quality of life for Jamaicans. That's it. How are we planning to do it? We have three objectives. We want to strengthen the accountability mechanisms of government. I miss the public sector. I spent 6 years there. My heart is still there. I kind of still consider myself a public servant, but just serving in a different capacity. But Jamaica has, I think, a very robust policy and legislative framework, really strong institutions, and in some spaces, perhaps more than others in the same island here, very dedicated civil servants. So what JAMP wants to do is to strengthen the accountability mechanisms that exist from a citizen's perspective. We want to educate the public. As we learn, we just want to bring them along. We are literally learning by doing. And as you well know, not everybody who learns and knows chooses to engage. So that's the third leg on the stool. We strengthen, we educate, and we are trying to stimulate citizens to begin to engage the parliament and engage government in a way that begins to see greater probity, more openness, transparency, translating into just a better quality of life. So that's in essence. I'm giving you a quick glimpse here at what is the tool that we're using. It's a digital tool. We have 3 trackers on the website at this point in time. The first one is really where the idea was birthed from. We saw 120 public servants really working hard. I don't think anybody can question the dedication of the Auditor General's department. I know Jamaica has tended to focus more on what was then the Contractor General, but I always thought that we were missing something by not putting our weight more behind those who are auditing in the nooks and crannies and spot the problems early before they become the headlines that we've gotten used to. So what JAMP had found is that there was no mechanism, quite serious matter, I think, no real mechanism in government to follow up the issues that our PAC, the Parliament, and the Auditor General would address. And so armed with tools that the government has given to citizens, we are utilizing the ATI Act to follow up these breaches to ensure that government fixes it. We keep the public, the media, and even the government stakeholders themselves abreast through this digital account meter. Our MP tracker, there's nothing we're going to do without our political representatives, parliament and government. This is what it is. And so we thought it was very important, if we're watching and providing oversight for civil servants, then we really have to go to where the seat of accountability is, and that's in the parliament. So we have been developing key performance indicators for our MPs. And last but by no means least, we have a legislative tracker. There is nothing you're going to accomplish in government without a policy framework and without a legislative framework to back it. That's the power of government, it's legislative arm. And we certainly don't have the resources to track everything, and we don't need to. But any piece of legislation that is in harmony with what JAMP is really trying to reinforce, which is public financial management, that is what we will be doing. So needless to say, we're very interested in what the ministry is doing now with the Independent Fiscal Council and the Customs Act, and we'll be sharing on our site shortly. So that gives you a quick idea of what JAMP is doing. Fortunately, we have caught the eye also of the Inter-American Development Bank, who has also now been coming alongside to help us to build out 3 more trackers. And I can tell you, one is going to be an interactive budget tracker that citizens and students can use to understand budget literacy more. And another one, which hopefully I get a chance to talk about, is a public bodies tracker. And that's another story, but that's just to give you a hint of what we're coming up with next. So for those who want to come and take a look, see, that's our website address, and we would really love to have you come and leave a comment. Now, what I'm going to do is not so much focus on what we're doing, because Jamaica, there's no CSO that's doing COVID budget tracking, but it's something JAMP would want to do. But I'm going to share with you really quickly what 2 other jurisdictions are doing. I think Alison mentioned one of them, but I had an opportunity to be in a webinar presenting with these 2, and I was really struck by them with several. It was Zimbabwe. We have here an organization, I think, that was formed in 2020, only 4 years after they passed their access to information legislation, and that is no coincidence. I think it's almost nigh impossible to do justice to this kind of tracking and partnering with government without government giving citizens that tool. But when the COVID pandemic came, though their focus has been on debt and pro-people and pro-poor policy, it was very easy after being in existence for 20 years for them to attempt documents like this. Now, this is just to give you an idea of what they're producing. They are tracking where money is coming from, where it is going, how much it is. They provide citizens with means of verification through links. I'm just going to show you one page here. We have an upgrading of a hospital with the Chinese embassy and business community helping, 500,000 US. And what we have over here is an example of how much they're drawing down. Each month, this is updated, and you can also see what they have actually done with the drawdown. You have the diaspora chipping in, and you have a detail as to where that money has gone, not just hospitals, but specific how much of the money and to which hospitals. You have the private sector, African Sun Limited, donating. Similarly, where is the money going? Now, that's an amazing thing, and time doesn't allow me to dig deep into it, but I really want to give those who are on this chat an opportunity to see it. So I'm going to drop in the chat a link where you can play a little bit with the tool that they have created. Not that PDF. That PDF is a report they generate, but there's a real lovely digital tool that you can have a look see. Now, last is the Philippines, and I was particularly drawn to this simply because of how it was birthed. This is really a bright young man. If you check him out on LinkedIn, he looks really young, but he has a lot of mileage. And he was working with the Ministry of Finance, and he had an aunt and a cousin who worked in the medical industry on the front line. And he realized that they weren't getting their PPEs, their personal protection equipment. And he wondered why. And I'm going to just basically show you what he did. He went on Twitter, April 1 last year, and just asked the question, is anybody making a tracker to track the allocation and the spending on COVID, and note the date? Nobody really answered. I checked the Twitter feed, and by April 2, he was out with a version 0 of a citizen's budget tracker. Now, by April the 3rd, he realized that there's no way he could do it on his own, despite the fact that he was an economist, he needed data scientists. So he just came to Twitter and said, hey, help is needed. This is what we need. Is there anybody else out there in the Philippines who can help? By April 4, he was saying, hey, I need auditors, I need accountants. And at the end of the day, guys, this is what happened. A community of 60 auditors, artists, lawyers, social workers, researchers. And what I got from the webinar that I was engaged in with them is that they actually don't even know each other. These are Filipinos in the diaspora and in the Philippines coming together, producing an amazing tool. I'll also drop the link in the chat so you can actually see what it is that they're doing. Now, my last two slides, what are they doing? Simplifying government data, making it easy for citizens to understand. This thing is really impacting us. And I don't know if anybody here has ever read the book called Night by Eli Wiesel. He was one of the Holocaust survivors. And I think he said, human beings can suffer if they know why they're suffering. The difficulty is it's raised exponentially when they don't know why they're suffering. So government has to make some decisions. We're tightening our belts, but when we don't know why, it's that much harder. And so they're providing that information. Number two, the legislative framework, particularly the emergency powers. Same here in Jamaica and around the world, the lockdowns, people really want to understand their rights. And so that is another service that they're rendering. Three, there's some things government is going to miss. We're on the ground, we're the ones being impacted. We want to think that our MPs and our councillors are on the ground too, but the truth is that their lives are still a little bit in a bubble that's different from some of the others. So what they're doing is identifying the gaps for the government, working with them to let them know, hey, you need to pay attention to what's happening here. And last, of course, recommendations. And what I found really interesting is that the Filipino government had really garnered quite a bit of money. You will see it when you go to the site. What this group found is that they were not spending it fast enough. What an amazing recommendation. The money's there. You just have to get to the needs a little bit quicker. So in closing, for CSO engagement, what are the things we're really going to need? And the truth of it is, for handling something like a COVID budget tracker, it really does take expertise. There's some things you can do as a CSO where out of your heart and out of just driven by love for country and your fellow citizens, you can be off and running. And that's not quite the case with trackers like this. Like the gentleman Ken Abante did in the Philippines, you're going to have to get help. Next thing is recommended is that you're going to have to seek your help in the existing civil society space that you have. That's what JAMP is doing. I've been in advocacy for 7 years. The beauty of it is that I now have a support team around me, different civil society organizations to help me where I'm weak, donor agencies to come on board. You're going to have to seat whatever you're doing in a broader civil society coalition and not try to do this on your own. Identify. I learned this in school. I know I'm learning it on the ground. You have to find the champions in government. I will say it publicly that JAMP has found several champions in government, but I think at the top of the list, if she doesn't mind me saying it, is the Auditor General's Department. We couldn't do what we do without a SAI, a Supreme Audit Institution that was willing to engage citizens and value the support we're trying to lend back to the institution. And last, tenacity, patience, and a whole heap of faith. Faith is just really being willing to go where you don't see the evidence of what you're doing. If you remember your Hebrews 11 verse 1, and that is what civil society has to do. But I want to just close by really commending two institutions of government that JAMP could not do this work without. Government has provided the tools, but I think it would surprise citizens to know, because it did surprise me, that the Office of the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Finance has been two of the most reliable agencies in responding to our ATI requests within a reasonable time frame. And so I just want to encourage citizens who, until we have such a COVID budget tracker, if there is anything you need, Jeanette will stand by the 1.5 years experience of saying, write to OPM, write to the Ministry of Finance. I really believe they have an excellent ATI team that will support you until we can, through OGP assistance and other donor partners, get a real COVID budget tracker off and running. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Lots of good examples there, and lots of valuable information. We're going to take to Francesco to talk a little bit about his experience as an international partner and some of the conditions for making these things work as well. Over to you, Francesco.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me, see me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon. Thanks a lot to Slashroots and then the Ministry of Finance for inviting me. And also, although they're gone, I wanted to thank PS Dunstan and the CMO, of course, for all of the work that they've done. You know, I've been here in Jamaica. I haven't left the island in 15 months, and I always appreciate greatly all of the work that has gone into keeping us safe and healthy. So on our side, there's a couple of things to be said. Matt had directed me to focus on a couple of things that I think are very relevant. The first is to say that what is that we have been doing in the Latin American Caribbean region with respect to the COVID emergency and transparency. We were lucky enough that when the pandemic arrived at the beginning of last year, we already had in place a program called Investment Map, which is essentially a tool that allows citizens to track the use of government resources. And at the time, we had investment maps in I think 5 countries, and we were working with Jamaica. And let me take the opportunity to again thank the Ministry of Finance and particularly my colleague Neil Hemans, who was our main counterpart in this project. At the time, we were working on the launch of Investment Map in Jamaica as well. And the launch took place in November of last year, and we were delighted, including because under the circumstances, it would have been easy for the government to just dismiss it and say, okay, let's hold on this at least until next year and postpone it. But the government was quite determined, and the Ministry of Finance was quite determined on pushing forward. And so we were able to launch Investment Map Jamaica in November. This is, as I mentioned, a platform that makes available information on public projects and particularly on spending and the physical advancement of projects. And it includes a module for citizens to contribute their views and also their own pictures and other type of inputs to these projects. The reason why I mentioned this is that while Jamaica launched this in 2020, there are a handful of countries that already had Investment Map functioning at the beginning of the year. With those countries, we worked on launching specific COVID-19 modules. So these are website platforms that allow for the full tracking of COVID-19 spending in a few countries. Actually, I think Alison was mentioning one of these earlier, which is the one in Paraguay. And we also have the same in Costa Rica and in Argentina. So what that did is essentially extract all the information that is available in government on the spending of COVID-19 for COVID-19 and to put it out there for the general public. I think what's interesting here is 2 reflections. The first is the readiness of data. These platforms are just only as good as the data that is available in the background to feed them. All of these platforms do not have a human being typing in any data or information. Everything is automated and information is extracted automatically from the public investment management systems of each country. And what we learned over the years is that the countries that over the years had invested in improving their own data for a variety of reasons, not only for transparency, but also for internal efficiency, were already in a position to make that available, and the platform was very effective. Other countries, at the same time as they were designing a platform such as this one, also had to come up with ways to make their own data and information more rigorous. So I invite people to go and check out the Investment Map platforms. As I mentioned, the Jamaica version does not include the COVID-19 module, but nevertheless, it's a fantastic platform that I definitely encourage people to consult and look up. The ones that do have the COVID-19 module, for example, Paraguay, you can Google Mapa Inversiones Paraguay, and you will be able to see that. A couple of reflection. Another thing that we have been doing in the last year, and this was not initially something we had considered for COVID-19, but actually turned out to work quite well, is work related to conflict of interest. So in Honduras last year, we launched a platform that allows citizens to view information about conflict of interest of public servants. And this is I cannot overstate the importance of these kind of work for a couple of reasons. The first is virtually all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have some framework for public officials to submit declarations of interest and to regulate conflicts of interest. But our experience at the IDB is that by and large, these legislations are extremely difficult to implement or are implemented in a very sloppy or inconsistent fashion. So for a country like Honduras to make available online a platform like that allows to sort of centralize this function is terrific progress. The other reason why I see this as an area of great interest across the region is that what we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic is that a time of great stress and economic and personal difficulties, citizens are especially sensitive to any perceived or real violations of that trust link that citizens and public officials are supposed to have. So even minor violations are perceived as really breaking that bond. The latest example just yesterday was Ted Cruz, in the U.S. taking off and flying to Cancun at a time when his own state was going through a tough time. You see that things that perhaps under normal circumstances would have been overlooked or dismissed that become a huge deal. So I really think over the coming years we're going to see more of that, more work going into the area of conflict of interest. The third area in which we have been working, and particularly in Jamaica, I'm very proud to say, is on beneficial ownership, which Alison also mentioned. We're doing a lot of work here with the company office to put in place a framework for beneficial ownership. And critical area in which, that is essential to understand where money is flowing both between the public and private sector and within the private sector. So it's another area in which Jamaica, I think, has done a lot of terrific work over the past couple of years, and where I think it's worth putting time and attention. Just in closing, one thought on my side regarding something that has come up during earlier presentation, but what are all these platforms? Essentially, at the end of the day, they do the same thing, which is make information available to the public. As it has been said, it's not sufficient, and in fact, it's only the beginning. We at the IDB have seen over the years moving our member countries moving from first generation transparency, which was essentially approving access to information laws, and then second generation, which was the platforms, including Investment Map. And now really we're looking pretty hard at what the third generation is, which is how do we ensure the quality, the reliability of information make sure that there are people on the other side who can receive that information and interpret it and understand it and use it. And I would say that's the hardest part, obviously. As far as Investment Map Jamaica is concerned, for example, it starts something that we have started thinking about. What do we do with all this information and all this data, and how can we really trigger that virtuous circle of accountability? That's it on my side. Matt, thank you for the invite. Thanks to the OGP group for their partnership, and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Francesco and Jeanette. I know we've went over time a little bit, so we're gonna take a couple very quick questions. If you do have a question or a comment, please feel free to drop it in. I'm gonna start with one that was shared via the chat. So commendation to Jeanette, your work is amazing. The question here is, have you had any challenges with using the Access to Information Act in your work, and what recommendations would you make for making the access to information process easier, better? Based on your experiences, are there any insights you have for what could be a good commitment the government can make in its OGP action plan?
Yes, I have been using the ATI Act since 2016, when the Jamaica Civil Society Coalition decided to look at the question of why is it we keep seeing these headlines from the Auditor General for decades without change. And we looked at 41 reports coming out of the Auditor General for 6 years, and simply decided to follow up with government to say, where are these things now? At the time, I can remember we had 22 agencies that we sent ATIs to, 236 ATIs, and we had 9 agencies responding out of the 22. Now we have formulated JAMP pretty much on the basis of the same methodology. And I would say it slowed down a bit at first. I think when it was perceived by the public sector as just being a passing research, it was a little easier to get information. But once it became established as an organization and they're like, wait, Jeanette now going away? She's here to stay. Mm-hmm. I think that was a little bit of a slowdown period. But what I find happening now is there are always going to be agencies of government that are going to really give you the runaround. There's an art and a science to writing access to information requests. It shouldn't be. Citizens should really just be able to write, the API officer be able to know what you want and just meet you where you are. But sometimes if you don't understand how the legislation is framed, then the way you write your ATIs, you can get a runaround, but it just means that after a while of running around with them, I have developed both the art and the science. The art, however, is what I would want to speak to. And that's just remembering that public servants have gotten used to and still exist under the official State Secret Act. It is a culture there. They're not inclined. There's not a proclivity towards sharing information. But what I do is I approach them as a Jamaican citizen. And I explain what it is that JAMP is trying to do, and I get them to understand why they have a vested interest as an ATI officer, and we're not anti-government, it's actually pro-government. So it's really relationship managers with the ATI officers on the front line and developing relationship with permanent secretaries from the day you send the ATI, so that if you run into a problem, your permanent secretary, who is the accountable officer, knows about the history of it. I do not take up the legislation and bludgeon ATI officers and say, I have an obligation and a right. It just doesn't work that way. So I think like everything in life, it's building relationships and always remembering that the ATI officers are part of a team. They don't produce the information. They are just there at the front line. So be kind and be gentle and understand sometimes that the problem is behind them. What I would like to see though is that the government would, we keep saying it, do the review of the ATI Act, so that in instances where we really face a challenge, that there are genuine sanctions that can be applied to hold public officials to account who simply refuse to play ball. That's it.
All right, thank you. I see a question here for Francesco. I also see his hand up to maybe come in. So I'm gonna give that question, read it out for everyone, but I'm also going to table a question for Professor Wint, and we'll take those 2 questions as we close. So the question to Francesco is from Jeanette, actually. Could you connect some of the dots for us with regards to how the IDB envisions that the beneficial ownership framework via the Companies Office would help in the nuts and bolts kind of way to combat corruption? Professor Wint, I'll ask you, as we, kind of close, one of the next steps for the OGP process is establishing this multi-stakeholder forum, which in many ways sounds very similar to the kind of partnership that the task force was. And so I guess the question to you is, what are some of the conditions for success of setting those things up, given this long history that Jamaica has and these iterations of social partnership that we've established? And then I'll hand over to Richard after that to close us off. So over to you, Francesco, and then to Professor.
Thanks, Matt. A really good question from Jeanette. That's why I raised my hand. Well, so beneficial ownership is about identifying who actually owns a company or other legal vehicle. And of course, when you look at it from that perspective, you immediately understand that any criminal organization of any kind has interest in hiding the ultimate beneficiaries of illegal activities. So what Jamaica is doing right now is essentially to implement the Financial Action Task Force standard on beneficial ownership, which should really significantly reduce the opportunity for people to hide the names of beneficiaries of companies that are being fueled by whether it is the proceeds of corruption, money laundering, drug trafficking, really anything. Now, the interesting part of your question is that this is going to be, as things currently stand, any enforcement of that regime is going to be entirely in the hands of the Jamaican government. Now, some countries and a lot of advocates around the world are saying, well, beneficial ownership registries should be public. Jeanette, should be able to go on a website and be either justifying my interest or not. I should be able to learn who is the ultimate owner of any company that is established in this country. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the detail, but it's a debate that has been extremely active and quite controversial worldwide. There are only a handful of countries that currently have a public registry of beneficial ownership. Most countries have one that is only accessible to law enforcement. So as far as Jeanette or JUMP are concerned, perhaps one of your issues on which to conduct advocacy over the coming years could be whether Jamaica is a country that may consider having a public beneficial ownership registry. But by saying that, I'm not necessarily endorsing the idea, and there are a lot of considerations that go into that. But it's definitely something that is worth thinking about.
Thank you. Over to you, Professor Wint.
Yes. Thanks very much for the question. I mean, it's really important. As I tried to point out, the social partnership process has been a long process, but an enduring one. It has transcended many administrations. I think it would be important, and I would certainly, offer this suggestion to Richard Lumsden and Ministry of Finance and Public Service, who have responsibility for this process, to link it with the existing social partnership process. There is a National Partnership Council that is chaired by the Prime Minister, and we believe Jamaica's social partnership process has been really important with respect to the ability of the country to deal with crises and several crises. I mean, the debt crisis, our energy crisis, the current national consensus on crime is a product of that process of social dialogue, and that consensus on crime is unprecedented in Jamaica in terms of its bipartisan support, combined with the involvement of civil society and the private sector. And I think people are starting to certainly hear from the Crime Consensus and Monitoring Committee, Crime Monitoring Oversight Committee. So I think it would be important to leverage all of this social dialogue, and it is so aligned to the open government partnership process. I think that leverage and that connection would be very, very important. So I certainly think that the ministry should consider in the development of its multi-stakeholder forum, and to leverage that partnership council structure. I think that would be very, very important.
Thank you very much, Professor Wint. Richard, over to you. Closing thoughts.
This is for closing now?
Yeah. Or any other thoughts before we close, if you have some as well.
Well, I think, we've had a long session. We got off to a little bit of a late start, and we certainly have benefited from the wide range of perspectives that have been shared and the wealth of information. So I would start by thanking all of the panelists who agreed to, and speakers who agreed to be a part of it. From the OGP, Alison Merchant, from the IDB, Francesco De Simeone, from the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Dunstan Bryan, and the Chief Medical Officer, Mrs. Jacqueline Biseso McKenzie, from JAMP, Jamaica Accountability Meeting Portal, Jeanette Calder, thanks very much. And of course, Professor Wint from the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force. Thanks to you, Matthew, and your team in the OGP Civil Society group that has been participating in the process for a couple of years now, and helped and led really in staging this webinar. We hope that it has been informative to all concerned, the panelists and the attendees. We know it would not have happened without the team, the production team here at the Ministry of Finance, the Jamaica Information Service, and at your end, the Roots Foundation, and the rest of your team that has been involved as well. So we thank everyone, and of course, the most important thanks is to those attendees who took the time to be a part of this event. We look forward to the next steps in the OGP process. I think one of the useful things, among others, from Professor Wint's presentation is providing a context. That history of social partnership provided a context not only for the Economic Recovery Task Force, but for the open government partnership process itself. And so we can see this process as being another step in that ongoing building of social capital and social partnership in Jamaica. So we hope that we will be able to build on the momentum of the process as we go into the next steps, which, as has been highlighted, intends to involve the establishment of the multi-stakeholder forum, and then the beginning of the co-creation process for our first national action plan under the OGP. So with that, I hand it back to you, Matthew, with thanks to all.
Thank you very much, Richard. In closing, our next pit stop is going to be, there's going to be a sensitization session for civil society regarding the OGP process in the first 2 weeks of March. So there more information about that will be shared momentarily. And that's when we really start to dive into deep. I mean, as Richard mentioned, we're going to be establishing the multi-stakeholder forum, and information about how you can participate in that process if you're interested will be available momentarily. Thank you all. Have a good Friday and enjoy the weekend.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Stay safe.
Yes.